I can be quite strict with films, and I try not to go with any kind of bias, but I can't help but smile, like grinning ear to ear when I hear that music and see that opening title crawl that comes at the start of every Star Wars movie. I just can't help it. I grew up on this stuff. Like a lot of people, I sat down with my dad as like an 8-year-old boy to watch the original trilogy, and even when the prequels came out, I was needlessly excited and not really rewarded for that because they suck, like everyone knows. So when a new Star Wars series was announced, I was hesitant. I knew that I really liked Star Wars movies and I wanted there to be more good ones, but I also knew that the last time someone had tried to add to the trilogy, even the original filmmaker behind it, it had sucked. When The Force Awakens came out 2 years ago, I was sort of pleasantly surprised. I felt like it was not an offensively bad movie and that was kind of all it had to be. In a sense, it reminded me of the Olympics opening ceremony that we had in 2012 for London. There's so much expectation around it, so many things that it ought to pay homage to, and in the end, it just managed not to actively offend anyone, which I think is a kind of fair accomplishment. But in the lead up to watching this, I'll confess I had to rewatch The Force Awakens because I actually couldn't remember very many specific plot elements about it. I really liked the characters in those films. I think Rey is great, I think Finn and Poe make excellent additions to the canon, and yet there was something sort of forgettable and, dare I say it, bland about that movie. After all, it was that sort of insidious soft reboot thing where it basically replays the major story beats of everyone's favourite film in the canon, just like, say for instance, Jurassic World. And afterwards there was that backlash from so-called fans who were saying that the film had some sort of SJW liberal agenda, whatever that means, by inserting a woman as the lead character. As if, you know, having women in science fiction is a completely new thing that we haven't had for 30 years and have never seen in Star Wars before. And seeing Rogue One didn't really help because it felt like someone trying to do a grown-up Star Wars film, getting rid of some of that pantomime stuff and still ultimately missing a lot of the point of why people like Star Wars, I think. So I had a very mixed set of feelings when I sat down to watch The Last Jedi, and I have to say I was very pleasantly surprised by the film. Right from the off, I think you get a good sense that Rian Johnson is the right guy to direct these movies. He's not a director who has these incredibly strong visual trademarks that people often associate with good directing. In fact, that's not really necessary to be a good director. It makes you maybe a famous one or a recognisable one, but it doesn't make you necessarily a good director. What Rian Johnson has that every good director needs is a real sense of what the audience wants to see at any one point in the film. The film has a sort of no-nonsense approach to telling its story, where it cuts very frequently, but not for style or show, just to tell you what's going on in the film. And then on top of that, Johnson has this lightness of touch with his actors, where he basically lets them do, you know, what in the case of Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill they've been doing for several decades by this point, which is play the characters that have been designed for them. As a result, a lot of The Last Jedi is quite quiet. It has a really explosive opening and a really explosive final act, and in the middle it's just people sitting and talking for most of the movie. But that's great. It means I know more about Rey and Kylo Ren and their motivations. It means I can see Finn meet and make friends with and have a relationship blossom with a new character who is introduced in the first 20 minutes or so of the film without that constantly being overridden by explosions and running around. And where the actors are able to trust their instincts, it means that the more emotional moments of the film ring a lot more true than The Force Awakens. My big problem with The Force Awakens, as I sort of touched on, is that it felt a lot like a retread of A New Hope. And so in a sense, it didn't feel like we were getting authentic emotional moments in a lot of the film, but just echoes of other emotional beats that have run throughout the other Star Wars movies. Here, on the other hand, a lot of those more intense emotional moments felt very true. And I think the best example of that is with Luke Skywalker and Kylo Ren. You know, you've got Mark Hamill, who is, I think, a really good actor who, for one reason or another, has basically played only 2 major roles in his whole career. And then you have Adam Driver as Kylo Ren, who is, he's just a real gift of an actor. He doesn't look like anyone else on this planet, I don't think. And the way that he approaches his performance is not something you tend to see in leading villains, even, in movies. He doesn't chew the scenery at all. It's very, like, introverted and sort of sad, I suppose. The scenes where they're apart and we understand their relationship a little bit more through their discussions with other people and through their interactions with the world that they're in build up to this fantastic conclusion at the end of the movie, a really epic standoff that I think will kind of fit quite nicely in the canon of the rest of the Star Wars films. And it's that emotional beat that really underlies the climax of the movie, much more so than all the smash bang wallop explosion stuff. I mean, stop me if any of this stuff is revolutionary. It seems like a pretty standard way to write a blockbuster, but weirdly it's something that most people just completely fail to do, and it's something this movie really manages to pull off. Of course, it's not just the case that the headline performers do this, but it's throughout the whole movie, and that's where you can really tell it's an ethos that comes from top down and kind of disseminates throughout the whole cast. I'll give an example of that. Domhnall Gleeson is looking down at Adam Driver's prone body when Kylo Ren has been beaten in a fight basically against Rey. Gleeson starts to reach for his blaster as if he's going to kill Ren, knowing what's going to happen, which is that Ren is going to take over the First Order. It's just a little moment, but it's used as a tiny aside to portray something very significant about the emotions in that character, in Hux, and about how thin a line he's treading in the First Order. Now, when you give good actors the ability to really inhabit good characters who are written by a screenwriter who understands the essential Star Warsiness, if that makes sense, of the film, the ineffable quality that every franchise has to have in order to please its fans. And then you take that and you give it to a director who really has a good sense of where the camera needs to be in order to tell the story to the audience at any single point. You end up with a set of sequences or set pieces which are essential to making a really good blockbuster. I think with the exception of Wonder Woman and War for the Planet of the Apes, there really weren't that many interesting set pieces in cinema. And a film like Thor Ragnarok is sort of completely free of any compelling set pieces. It has nothing in it at all that's like that. So it was really thrilling to watch a film that had proper structure and told its story through these big actiony set pieces that I actually cared about because I knew what the characters were doing in them. I mean, come on, it's really basic screenwriting. I'm not reinventing the wheel with this one. I'm saying they just managed to do what they ought to be doing in every single one of these movies. I will say that there are a number of sequences in this film that aren't quite set pieces, but are still really well put together concepts for scenes. And two examples come from Rey training with Luke. In the first instance, when Luke has explained to her about the Force, there's this wonderful moment when she has these like really quick cut visions of different parts of the island where she's feeling the Force emanating through stuff. And it feels almost, I hate to say it, lyrical. It's quite a clever way of showing something that's been heavily implied in the films before, but hasn't ever really been shown. And it's also a low-tech thing. It's not the Force as like this glowing, swirly object. It's just life on the island. And I think that's a wonderful way of approaching that. And the other example is when Luke watches Rey training with her lightsaber and kind of has this realization about how dedicated she is to discovering more about herself. Nothing much happens in it. She's basically training on her own with her staff. And then she puts it down, picks up the lightsaber, and starts doing some of the same sorts of moves. And she's working her way through this sort of routine. And behind her, unbeknownst to her, we see Luke come up over the crest of a hill or out of a cave or something, and he just watches her doing it, and he's kind of amazed by her skill. And then she overbalances or pushes too hard and then slices through this rock. And he's a bit horrified, and it reflects that fear he has of making another Kylo Ren. No one says anything in the sequence, it's not particularly showy, it's just a set of very normal shots that tell you a really interesting story about the characters and where they are at that point in the wider story of the film. It's basically a proper example of directing and writing and acting. So, you know, so the film has a lot of annoying characteristics to it. It has 10 minutes at the start that feels kind of pantomime-y and like amateur theatre, and it's just not compelling or cool. It does a lot of things that stretch my belief, like bombers having to bomb like planes even though they're in space, and people just being able to breathe in stuff that's exposed to vacuum. And it seems to add powers in when it works for it. Princess Leia managing to somehow will herself from outer space back into a spaceship that's been ruptured is slightly questionable. And the thing is, you know, none of that stuff is unsolvable, but it does sort of stretch the audience belief. It's basically like, look guys, you're gonna have to come along with us on this because that's how we want things to go. And one last thing, I know people get annoyed about product placement, but it is a bit frustrating when you are watching a film and you can just feel the screenwriters being told to insert more characters who can be toys in the movie. Like every decent, rational human being, I think porgs are probably the best animal who ever have fictionally existed. But do we also need crystal foxes and like giant alien space horse cats? The guards who look after Snoke, do they need to each have a different sort of weapon, or is that just so we can sell more accessories for their toy line? But I'm going to take all those gripes and sort of push them down and just say this movie really delivers on what it needs to deliver for fans, for people who like these films. And it passes what is for me kind of an essential question for this sort of movie, which is, will this inspire children in their imaginative play? Will it become part of their own interior fictional universe? And I think the answer is yes. Not just because it's a really representative and diverse cast who will hopefully inspire children who otherwise might have felt slightly left out by the people in the films not reflecting them very closely, but also because it's full of really inventive and interesting visual settings and ideas. And I think that's a really valuable, if slightly hard to define, thing that I sometimes don't make enough noise about. And it managed to surprise me, which is a rare thing in a movie like this, on this sort of scale, in this size of a franchise. First of all, that Snoke died and was murdered by his apprentice. The other one, which I think is more subtle but also really interesting, is that Rey's parents are not important. and they don't seem like they're going to be part of the story moving forward. Because otherwise it would have been this sort of semi-Freudian royal fantasy thing where you turn out you're really secretly a princess and your real parents abandoned you years before. I'm happy that they're just nobodies and that she has earned how she gets where she's going. I think that's an interesting trend that's come up in a lot of blockbusters over the last couple of years and was really, really well parodied by the Lego movie. The idea that the chosen one could just be anyone who decides to step up to the plate. So yeah, I like this film and I thought it was well worth seeing. And for a company that's so aggressive in its business practices that it actually restricts people from being able to see its films for review copies just because that newspaper has reported on their quite possibly very corrupt practices. For a company that has these incredibly aggressive marketing tactics where it requires independent cinemas to sign these really, really restrictive screening contracts that I have left a link in the description for you to read more about because it's a disgusting thing for them to do. And for a company that now, thanks to their Fox merger, has an incredible and, to be honest, very scary to me stranglehold on popular culture and what most audience will see in any given year, for them to have turned out a film that I think is, you know, kind of a 4-star movie, it's not really that much of an achievement, is it? So that's my review of The Last Jedi. I'd love to find out what you thought about the film and how you think it'll fit into the kind of imaginative canon of the Star Wars films. And I'm also interested to see what you think about some of that stuff I was just talking about, Disney and its practices and this merger they're having with Fox. So come and comment down below. I'd love to have a discussion with you and find out what you're thinking. Don't forget to click the like button if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see the next one when it comes out, click subscribe, and you can even tap that little bell button so you get a notification when it's coming. That's it from me. Have a good one, and I'll see you later. Bye for now.